Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
We are looking at sentences. We are looking at sentences for us to see underlying patterns, and we are also looking at sentences to see the underlying patterns at a larger scale that we started with. In order to understand relationship between language and mind, we are looking at underlying patterns at the level of sounds, words and sentences. We have been spending considerable amount of time in understanding underlying patterns at the level of sentence. Having understood contents of a sentence, having gone through different parts of a sentence, and having looked at what makes a sentence, that is, the required and visible and not so visible parts and elements of a sentence, we want to look at certain aspects of a sentence which can demonstrate these patterns in clearer fashion, that these underlying patterns happen at a certain underlying level of mental representations. We have looked at movement and some examples of movement where we tried to argue that there are cases of displacement in natural language. We got examples from English to see that in certain cases, and we took examples from WH questions, that it appears that certain parts of a sentence has moved from one place to the other. In the case of WH movement, what we saw was a part of IP has moved out of IP, and we needed to account for that. We needed to account for that in the sense that if we don't, then the whole discussion of the structure fails. So we needed to account for that displacement within existing structural representation, which we claim and which we are trying to show as an evidence for underlying patterns of mental representation. So we looked at that. We want to put a little bit more emphasis on the relationship between CP and displacement, that's a complementizer phrase, and movement, for us to see this pattern further in terms of its motivations. So we have said that an element in one position, when it goes to some other, that is called movement. And there has to be a physical evidence of such a movement. There has to be a relationship between the two elements to establish that the same element from one position has gone to the other one, and then there has to be logical evidence for such a situation. What did we see last time from the examples that you see on the screen? This is a canonical example of a structure of a sentence. If any element out of this moves from one place or from its place, then we need to account for its displacement. If it has moved, it will go to some place, and then we need to account for its displacement from its place to where. And thus that helps us understand underlying motivation for it. So from the canonical position, it moves to some other position. And we have seen an example of a WH element moving from the object position of a sentence, going beyond CP, going beyond IP, and then we accounted for that within the conceptual framework of a CP, where CP becomes a superstructure and IP becomes part of that CP. So that was accounted for. When we want to look at further motivations, further evidence for such a movement, we need to locate those evidence and the instances that we have seen within the conceptual structure to argue that these are really certain processes taking place in the underlying pattern, and only an understanding of an underlying pattern can help us recognize these processes at a different level of structure. Alright, so how do we find such a motivation? Remember, at one point while discussing the phrase structure, while discussing why a sentence is called an IP, why a sentence is a phrasal category, we argued that I appears to be bundle of features. At that level, some argued that how is it possible that one node and one category can combine or can host a series of elements in one place. This was a compelling reason for dismantling these features and arguing that these features are independent categories in natural languages, and thus they are going to be projected independently with their own phrases, where these features will have their own phrase and they are going to be in the head of those phrases. Now, this is relevant in the context of displacement, and I will connect the two in a moment. But for the time being, please look at I hosting a bundle of elements together. When it got separated, this is an important story for us to understand the conceptual link and an understanding of phrase structure in terms of sentences. So we started with the idea of I as the head of the sentence, that is head of an IP, and that was a beautiful point, that was a beautiful explanation at one point in time in the history of a study of language, which unified all the structures of phrases and described a sentence also as a phrase by identifying the head of a sentence as the crucial aspect in formation of sentence. Remember, we don't need to go too far behind to see this argument. We saw that two parts of a sentence, like subject and objects and verbs, where verbs and objects belong to another part which we call predicate, and then there is another part which is subject. Remember, these two parts of a sentence are not merely juxtaposed next to one another. They are connected with certain visible or invisible elements. Those elements are primarily responsible for giving those strings a sentencehood. And those are the elements which were traditionally described as functional elements. And under the notion of X bar, when we explained a sentence as an IP, we bundled those features as I, and such features became the head of a sentence. Thus far was very nice. Then the next level of discussion was, if I hosts a lot of things at a time in one place, how is it going to be possible? And then it was proposed that each of them is probably going to be projected as phrases with them as the head of those phrases. then what you see on the screen is an expanded structure of the same sentence, John likes pizza, where ideally you would see the subject in the specifier position of the IP and the predicate under VP. That notion has to be captured, and then under the two red lines you see all the elements being expanded which was being hosted by I, that is agreement, tense and aspect to begin with. So what's going on here is I is just being expanded. It's not complicated. Please pay careful attention to the sentence in this. I'll take you back to the original structure from where we started. This is a structure. This is where we are saying I has present, but we are in a way discarding rest of the features and we are not putting them in under I. Then we realized, so this is the structure, this is the canonical structure of an IP. Then we realized that I has got several other things as well. Then in the next structure we have merely expanded the bundle of features under I, and then we get this thing. There is another worth noticing point here, which was an important part, which was part of an important argument, important discussion at this time, and this will help you understand the underlying pattern and the notion of displacement and many other things that are interrelated in a very nice way. And here is what you see. Please see that the spec position of IP is empty, which is a position for subjects. The reason why it is empty is the argument that something with its subject, it's out of predicate for sure. But how does it happen that a lexical element which is going to be part of lexical domain at a conceptual level is part of functional domain? How does it happen that a lexical element gets projected in functional domain of IP, even though it is at the specifier position of IP? How does it happen? In short, the idea was nothing gets projected in the functional domain at the surface structure. So it has to originate at some other place. Then the argument was given that probably the subject also originates within the verb phrase at a conceptual level, where we see a different level underlying the underlying pattern in human mind. This is an important argument for us to see the relationship between language and mind, to see the structure of language, to understand what underlyingly happens in human mind related to language. So we see that the subject originates within the VP. Look at the screen once again, and you will see under the second red line that the subject originates at the specifier position of the VP. So this is how it is going to look like. So I am simply going to draw a VP for you to see. Remember, this is going to have a specifier, and then you have V and NP, where V is like and the predicate and the object of this head is pizza. We have looked at the relationship between these two and how several other kinds of things are taken care of at this level. Whereas at this point, what I am trying for you to see is in the conceptual structure, there are things that are beyond this. So at this level, look at this. The argument is the John, NP John, which happens to be the subject of this sentence, originates at this level. Because if it is allowed to originate at some other level, as you see on the screen, then it ends up in a functional domain. And the argument is that cannot be conceptually happening. Now, how does this work then? The argument here is, see how the argument is building for displacement. We have IP, we didn't want one node to host too many features, we expanded them. That brought to our notice that in the inflectional domain, where we have a lot of stuff like agreement, tense, number, person, gender, aspects, negation, and a lot of others, in that domain with those many features, it is not conceptually viable to have a subject originated in the spec position of any one of them. Therefore, the proposal of subject being originated in the specifier position of the VP. That was one argument. Then it conflicts with the other one, which is if it originates in the VP, within the VP, then it becomes a part of predicate, whereas subject has to stay out of VP. So at one conceptual level, which was given several names, logical form, deep structure, etc., etc. So we are saying we are not interested in those names. All I want you to see the argument that to protect these things, we are saying it does originate at the specifier position of VP. But having originated from that place, it needs to displace to get a sentence where subject is away from the predicate at a surface level. Therefore, I am trying to say that such an understanding helps us understand two things. One, the underlying structure within the patterns of sentences in human mind, number one. Number two, it helps us understand the processes that is taking place under at those levels, at the conceptual level, which is not really visible. Thus, the fact that this needs to displace from this position is a very strong motivation, is a very strong reason for displacement. So, here is what I have tried to summarize. A lexical NP which is in the specifier position of an IP appears to be in the functional layer. Feature, the head I is a bundle of features, and when every single feature gets fully projected, the problem is that subject ends up in the functional domain, which gives birth to the argument that subject has to be originating in the VP. And then if it is allowed to originate in VP at some conceptual level, then at surface level it has to go outside the VP, which happens to be as one of the strongest motivation for movement. And thus we see one of the motivations for movement coming up. There is a problem related to the case assignment. What we have seen last time, that the subject NP needs a case assigner to have nominative case assigned to subject. You see the position of this thing? NP, subject NP here in the spec of BP. This cannot be allowed to stay here for one more reason, that one reason is it has to be outside the predicate. The other reason is it will not have a case assigner here because this head assigns case to its complement. It will need one more head to assign a complement, and therefore for the requirement of a nominative case assigned to the subject NP, it needs to go to a different place. The subject NP needs to go to a different place for the assignment of case where a functional head is available to assign a nominative case to it. Whether the functional head operationally assigns a nominative case or it ends up checking its nominative case with that functional head is a matter of theoretical discussion, is a matter of theoretical steps. The empirical fact is it needs or it requires checking of its nominative case at some level of functional element. Therefore, it needs to stay outside the movement, outside the VP as well. So, you see there are more reasons than one why a displacement must take place. Last time when we looked at instances of elements moving outside IP. Today we are looking at reasons why certain NPs must move from where it originates. Thank you.